Okay, thank you very much, Achim, for inviting me to participate in this panel, but I want to actually start with a disclaimer here. Achim asked me to speak about the international implications of the German election, but I do not conduct research on German foreign policy or Germany's international relations, and will therefore approach the task more as an international relations generalist, and to some extent at the very end as a critical IR theorist than an expert. Undoubtedly, the Sunday election is of considerable international significance. The US historian Timothy Snyder told the German magazine Stern in a recent interview that, quote, "Germany is now the most important democracy in the world." I think a statement that is very telling, not for what it says about Germany, but for what it says about the United States. But I would certainly agree with Snyder that the German election is of enormous significance for international relations. And I will discuss this significance sort of in very traditional international relations fashion, sort of in two directions, outside in and inside out. And what I mean by that is, first, I will sort of talk about some of the international context, but in a very limited and selective way that affected the election. And even though I ultimately agree with Achim that sort of transatlantic relations and sort of the bombshell that J.D. Vance dropped at the Munich Security Conference and Elon Musk's shenanigans with the AfD that were not decisive for the result of the election, I think there is something of very important symbolic significance here, which needs to be acknowledged. And then secondly, in a more inside-out mode, I will discuss the issue which Ambassador Bellman and Achim also already touched on, the implications for Germany's participation in the efforts to address the Ukraine crisis. And I will approach all of these subjects in a kind of fact-checking, interpretative, and problem-solving mode, but conclude in a bit more of a critical mode in reflecting about how the German election sort of reflects on larger issues of global order. So, to begin with the outside-in dimension, as I said, I will only focus on transatlantic relations here, obviously not including Canada. I mean, unless Canada becomes the 51st state, although they would more likely be the 53rd state after Greenland and Gaza. So I already referred to the transatlantic bombshell that dropped on the German election in the speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference less than 2 weeks ago, a speech that, as you know, downplayed the significance of the Ukraine war and potential threats from Russia or China. And I mean, there's sort of a historical irony here in that Munich, the city of Munich, is in IR discourse is always associated with 1938 and sort of appeasement, and how appeasement is a big mistake. And I mean, obviously we saw here an appeasement of sorts as well in downplaying any threats from Russia and China, this time coming from the Vice President of the United States. And instead of Ukraine or Russia, what Vance, of course, as you all know, identified as a far bigger threat is what he called the threat from within, the supposed suppression of far-right popular or democratic sentiment, a suppression of free speech, supposedly uncontrolled immigration, up to the suppression of democracy itself through the firewall against cooperation with the far-right AfD. And I cannot resist but to do a little bit of fact-checking here. This goes a little bit outside my purview in this assignment to speak about international implications, but I do want to question Vance's understanding of democracy, where he identifies democracy with about 20% of the German electorate, whereas the 80%, or let's say 70%, because some of the other parties are not so clear, who do not agree with the AfD, do not seem to represent democratic sentiment. I want to disagree with the supposed official suppression of free speech for the far right, with a small anecdote which my sister, who is a journalist, shared with me So she is an editor for the local news in the Cologne area, and she told me that there was a school which organized an event with the candidates of all the major parties except the AfD, and that her public broadcaster was barred from covering that event because the AfD was not going to be represented. Eventually, the school was not allowed to hold that event, but a pastor offered asylum to the event in his church, where the public broadcaster was then allowed to cover the event, but only if they also interviewed a representative of the AfD to say what he thought or what they thought about the event. So much for the suppression of free speech of the far right. Uncontrolled immigration. Under the Scholz government, the rate of deportations of rejected asylum seekers or refugees doubled from about 10,000 in 2020 to about 20,000 in 2024, which is the highest level since 2019 under Angela Merkel, ironically, and it was even higher in 2015 and 2016. And finally, the suppression of democracy through the firewall, yes. But I suppose that in that case, the most far-right identity and democracy group in the European Parliament also suppressed democracy last year when they excluded the AfD from their parliamentary group for exculpatory statements that the AfD lead candidate had made about the SS. But now I will return to my assignment of talking about the international outside-in implications of Vance's speech, and now I'm being a little bit more interpretative. So to me, this signified three things, and maybe this is a little bit bombastic and premature, but at least for now, it appears that it signified the end of the West. The end of the West as an identity, a community of values, and a community of liberal democracies in international politics. Or the end of the liberal international order. And I say the end of the end because the end of the liberal international order started at least under George W. Bush and the US so-called war on terror and its implications. The second sort of takeaway from the Vance speech, I think, which is sort of indicative of the times in which we live, is the weaponization of liberal values for illiberal purposes. So free speech and democracy to basically defend parties with very questionable liberal credentials or frankly illiberal credentials, a tactic that the Russian and Chinese governments or human agents or non-human bots acting on their behalf have also become very good at. And third, and I will be a little bit provocative here, I think Vance's speech also signifies a kind of affirmation or reaffirmation of normative whiteness for de facto multicultural societies. And the mode of this affirmation of normative whiteness is very familiar. It is the securitization of immigration, and of course, this is not something that is unique to the US Vice President, but unfortunately, this has been the case across a significant section of the political spectrum in Germany, reaching sort of from the CDU to the far right and also into the far left with the BSW, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. Now, as I said initially, ultimately I agree with Achim that none of this was really decisive for the outcome of the German election as such. So I want to sort of introduce some qualifications here. One is that Western officials at the Munich Security Conference said that in private conversations, Vance and the new US Defense Secretary were much more conciliatory and cooperative. And that Vance's speech may ultimately have been less for the audience in Munich and more for the audience of one in the Oval Office. Nevertheless, of course, there's not just J.D. Vance, but there's also Elon Musk's overt partisanship for the AfD. the courting of Alice Weidel, the AfD leader, writing a pro-AfD op-ed piece, echoing AfD anti-immigration rhetoric, making a video appearance at an AfD rally, and offering Weidel an interview opportunity on X in the run-up to the election, which led Chancellor-designate Friedrich Merz to speak quite correctly, I think, of unprecedented electoral interference by the US on a par with Russian electoral interference practices. But I think Vance's and Musk's personal interventions only scratch the surface of this, and what I think is more significant, but I can only provide you an anecdote here. As I said, I don't do research on this, so I had to do a little bit of research to prepare this presentation. And one very interesting thing that I found is that though all German, an Irish-based research team found that although politicians of all German parties post in approximately equal quantities on X, the content produced by the AfD and the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, one of the far-left parties, but with that anti-immigrant slant, were recommended more often than the content of politicians of the more mainstream parties, and that Musk's personal retweets of Alice Weidel alone amplified her messages 10 to 15-fold compared to average retweeting. This indeed is similar to Russian electoral interference, which rather than endorsing particular candidates or particular parties, as we know, works more through the creation of a fractured or polarized online public sphere by creating a climate of political division, polarization, and mistrust, which I think in the long term is far more corrosive to Western democracies than sort of these personal shenanigans by the likes of Vance and Musk. But in the end, as I already started with, I do agree that all of this did not really move the needle on the German election as such. So there was considerable stability in the polling results from before Vance's and Musk's interventions up until election day. So I don't think this really mattered to the result, or if it did, I think in a more dialectical way, namely in the sense that it brought tens of thousands of people to the streets of Germany on the weekends preceding the election, demonstrating against the far right by the kind of globalization of the German election that had occurred through Vance's and Musk's interventions. And in the long term, as I already indicated, what I consider more dangerous are atmospheres of algorithmic anesthesia, whereby far-right positions in particular are normalized on the one hand, or climates of chronic suspicion and polarization which undermine trust in official political institutions and processes, whether they are transmitted through transatlantic or Eurasian cables and satellite signals. I've spoken for too long already, I'm afraid, but so a little bit inside out. What does this mean sort of for how Germany and Europe are positioned? What does the German election mean for how Germany and Europe are positioned with respect to what happens to Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia war? This was certainly one of the important issues in the electoral campaign, not quite as important as the economic situation and immigration, but it certainly weighed very heavily on the minds of the lead candidates. Both Merz and Scholz said in one of their TV debates before the election that this is what kept them up at night. Ukraine is what kept them up at night. I think the outcome of the German election is both bad and good news for Ukraine. So it is bad news in the sense that international diplomacy, as the US Ukraine envoy recently said, now works on Trump time, so that things could happen very quickly. I mean, we have yet to see if that will really happen. I think this will work more on Putin time than on Trump time, but I mean, it is bad news because, as Ambassador Bellman explained earlier, there will now be coalition talks, which will probably go on for 2 months, if not longer than that. And even though a caretaker Scholz government will conduct official business, I think this will complicate Germany's involvement in any negotiations around whatever's going to happen to Ukraine, whether it's around more military support or around peace negotiations if they happen. So I think Germany will effectively be a kind of obstacle to any renewed military commitment to Ukraine, even though Annalena Baerbock, the outgoing foreign minister, leaked shortly before the election that a 700 billion euro package of military support was in preparation for Ukraine, but it seems that the two hastily arranged meetings in Paris did not really resolve anything, and I doubt whether without sort of effective German participation in European negotiations, much will happen on that file for the time being until a coalition government is formed, even though there will, of course, be running commentary from the incoming chancellor, or most likely Chancellor Friedrich Merz and his party. There are further practical complications as far as German support for bolstering Ukraine or peace negotiations are concerned, and this sort of has to do with larger issues of Germany's contribution to NATO as well. And what I'm referring to is that obviously a new aid package for Ukraine would require a significant German financial commitment, which a caretaker government is unlikely to make, and Merz may not even be willing to make, even though he sort of in the final stages of the electoral campaign signaled that he was willing to consider reforming the so-called debt brake in the German constitution, which sort of requires, not to incur massive budget deficits. I saw an article in The Guardian last week which sort of basically referred to a time bomb that had been hidden from German voters, which is the needed increase in defense spending to maintain the 2% contribution to NATO, which has been reached for the first time under the Scholz government, but only through the help of a special fund that was created after Scholz's famous Zeitenwende turning point speech in 2022. Since a reform of the debt brake would actually require a 2/3 majority in the German parliament, a 2/3 majority which a coalition government of the CDU and the Social Democrats would not have, it is very uncertain where that money for increased defense spending by Germany would come from. Die Linke has signaled that they want a reform of the debt brake, but I can guarantee you that they don't want it for increased defense spending. In terms of a peace agreement, a potential peace agreement, if it happens, and German participation in policing this, I think there are also considerable obstacles here, already shown by the difficulties in putting together sort of a force of 5,000 German troops in support of Lithuania as part sort of NATO's deterrent capability, which is sort of planned for the near future. But apart from these practicalities, it is of course well known that German pacifist sentiment still runs very deep, and which is why both Scholz and Merz were very hesitant to make any commitments of the sort that Keir Starmer already made of contributing troops to a potential peacekeeping force in Ukraine. What this means for Merz is very muscular calls for emancipation from the US and the creation of an independent European defense capability is very uncertain for both of these sort of fiscal and political cultural reasons. So I said at the beginning of this section that there's also good news here, and I think I don't have to really go or say much about this because Ambassador Bellman also touched on this. The good news is that to a large extent there is agreement between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats on how Germany should position itself vis-à-vis Ukraine. And there are some disagreements on the details. So the Christian Democrats supported supplying Ukraine with cruise missiles, whereas the Social Democrats consider this to be an escalation, which would make NATO a party to the conflict which they want to avoid. But all in all, there is no fundamental disagreement. And another sort of possibility or perspective is that the outgoing Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius, who is currently the most popular politician in Germany, may also be the incoming Secretary of Defense if a coalition government of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats materializes. So he may stay on the file, and he always had a somewhat more hawkish position on Ukraine than Scholz and the rest of the party. So I will conclude with, as I said, with a few sort of critical reflections, or with, I mean, obviously there are many, many other things I could have talked about here. So although Achim may be much more qualified to talk about them, what does this mean for the EU? So Merz has signaled that he wants Germany to take more of a leadership role again in the EU, and it is true that the previous government was hampered as this three-way coalition because they often had to abstain from important decisions at the EU level because there was internal disagreement within the government coalition, and this may be less likely with the new two-party coalition. As for transatlantic relations, Merz's early pronouncements have been nothing short of dramatic or stunning, really a sort of a U-turn from the CDU platform and from Merz's general predisposition towards pro-Atlanticism or towards seeing the US as the most important partner for Germany in international politics. And so, I mean, what has sort of emerged from him now after the election is really almost a kind of farewell to the US. And I mean, one irony of this is, I mean, in terms of the European cooperation that Merz has called for is a reversal of sorts of Brexit. I mean, that Britain is being brought much closer again to the major powers within the EU. And the situation perhaps became, and sorry for chasing the headlines here, but the situation perhaps became even more dramatic yesterday when the UN Security Council adopted a US-sponsored, the first common US-sponsored resolution on Russia and Ukraine, which did not name Russia as the aggressor and refrained from demanding a Russian retreat from occupied Ukrainian territories, a resolution that was adopted by a 10 out of 15 majority with the votes of the US, Russia and China, while all 5 current European members of the UN Security Council, including the permanent and the non-permanent ones, abstained. I did not have the time to research this, but I suspect that this is the first time that the UN Security Council voted in this constellation, and that the US has really put itself in opposition to what we used to call the West. This reference to an opposition brings me to my final point, which has to do with the need and challenge for Germany and for the EU and Europe to re-envision global politics and the very meaning of international community in a now quite definitively post-Western era. So German parties may appear to be very good at domestic coalition building. This is, as Ambassador Bellman also pointed out, the normal mode of operation in German politics. But I mean, in preparation for this presentation, I looked at all the platforms of the German parties, and I realized that German parties are not very good at international coalition building. And I want to briefly explain that. I mean, also in the full realization that party platforms are, of course, written for virtual citizens or nerdy voters and not for nerdy academics. But I mean, what struck me really is that apart from commendable but somewhat formulaic references to global solidarity, feminist and decolonial foreign policy, and international relations in the case of the Social Democrats and the Greens, there was very little sense of how the world of the 21st century has changed. And what I mean by that is really that the world has become a post-Western world. So, to caricature a little bit, I would characterize the party platforms in the following way. The CDU, for example, singled out Africa as a space of opportunity, especially economic opportunity, but perhaps also a nice place in the sun for a vacation. The Social Democrats think of the non-Western world as a space of bonding with the like-minded, so the democracies, for example, that are members of the BRICS or BRICS Plus. And perhaps also as a space for distributive justice. The Greens think of the rest of the world as a space of development, compassion, solidarity, and civil society engagement. And these are my terms. This is not quoting from the platforms. My caricatures, I should qualify. And Die Linke, I mean, that was the most interesting one. I think the non-West is sort of a space of nostalgia. I mean, Cuba was mentioned no less than 3 times in the platform of Die Linke. So, in all of what is missing in all of this? What is missing here, I think, is a recognition that the non-West or the global South is a space of agency and initiative, and a space for building post-Western international community from which German and European policymakers may have something to learn and which they should engage in. And from this perspective, there may be a sort of a dialectical possibility, sort of in the hypothetical exclusion of European countries from US-Russian peace talks on Ukraine, a kind of learning moment for global solidarity, where Europeans will have the experience of what it may mean to police international agreements that have been made without their participation, or to abide by the rules of a rules-based order in which your own rule-making input is rather limited and the rules often appear to apply selectively.